I am honored today to welcome all of you to this edifying gathering on behalf of Distribution Advocates and IDA. Before I introduce our main speakers, I'd like to give a shout out to my dedicated colleague, Keisha Knight, the IDA Funds Director, who is actually behind all of the planning of this event. Thank you, Keisha. I also want to thank our production team, Tina, our cart captioner, Selena, Benny, our ASL interpreters, and Sergio, our Zoom technician. And now I would like to introduce the unmatched Karen Chen. Karen is an award-winning producer and distributor committed to bold voices and innovative forms that help build radical practices of ethical filmmaking. Karen is a partner in Louverture Films. She's a co-founder and president of the distributor Degenerate Films. She is a founder and a president of the global production company Art in Action. She's also the director of the Nevada City Film Festival Residency and a founding member of the Distribution Advocates. Welcome, Karen. Thank you so much for sharing all of this knowledge with us today.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's such a pleasure to be here, and we can't see the participants, but we welcome you. Thank you for being here. This is a series of teach-outs or teach-ins that I have been doing along with another founding member of Distribution Advocates, Avril Speaks. And we have been working all year, actually for the last 18 months, on collaborating on teach-ins with filmmaker collectives, with organizations, and really trying to tailor a way of communicating distribution knowledge that sticks and is accessible for filmmakers. And our funding comes from Perspective Fund and Ford Foundation. So our focus, our audience is very much on emerging documentary filmmakers, on BIPOC filmmakers, on a diversity of filmmakers. So we've looked on a macro level at systemic issues with the distribution and exhibition landscape. And we try to work in micro ways too, like interventions into sales and distribution negotiations. So this is a really key part of our work. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with two extraordinary filmmakers. We don't do our teach-ins by ourselves. We always invite filmmakers from your community. And that is to help make the information more real. And that is really we hope, a step towards what we would like to see more of in the community, which is solidarity, especially in the distribution process. So thank you, Steve and Emma, for being here in solidarity with us and being open to communicating and sharing your experiences around distribution. So I will ask if you will take the opportunity to introduce yourselves. And it would be, I think, in the context of this conversation, helpful to know what you've worked on before that has been distributed, and if you have any projects in distribution or in sales or entering into that at the moment. Yeah, Emma, do you want to go first?
Sure, and thank you for having us, Karen and IDA. My name is Emma Miller. I am primarily a producer, have also worked as a creative executive and development executive within nonfiction production and financing companies. Most recently, I produced Ileana Sosa's debut feature, What We Leave Behind, which was acquired by Array Releasing and was released on Netflix at the end of September. So we're sort of in that distribution phase of things and focused on marketing, awards, publicity, making sure the film gets seen. So definitely this is very relevant to where we're at with that film now. Outside of the work that I've done on a number of films, when I was a development executive at Concordia Studio, I also have worked on the short documentary Knife Skills, which was directed by Tom Lennon, and that sort of did lots to say about the rollout of that and the distribution process for a short that's you're sort of seeking distribution for and pushing for awards. And then also the the documentary Unrest by Jen Brea, which there's lots to say about that the no longer extant but really amazing Sundance Creative Distribution Fellowship supported that film. So took sort of a hybrid approach through, Netflix independent lens, and then also at the time, like really pushing it to target specific audiences. So looking forward to sharing experiences with you all today. And just before I pass it to Steve, I'm a white woman with curly brown hair in a brown sweater in front of a yellow couch. Yeah, and very happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Steve Mang, and I'm calling in from Queens, New York, which is Lenape land. I go by he and him. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm a huge fan of Emma's most recent film. Everyone should go out and see it. It's incredible. And I have been a longtime fan of Karen's work as a producer, but also more specifically her work with Degenerate Films. As a China film cinephile, she has really put important work on the map that would have never been seen. And so I guess that's a segue. One of my first features was a film called High Tech Low Life, which dealt with censorship issues and freedom of speech issues in China. And so it was kind of a perfect introduction to this idea that all of our films not only have to deal with kind of the inherent challenges of the distribution landscape, but also the inherent challenges of each film. And so mine was a film that was clearly not going to get wide distribution in mainland China, and experienced a lot of pushback actually from the Chinese government when we would go to certain festivals, and when we got our PBS deal, they actually tried to thwart that. And so it was very instructive to me that like the partners we choose are incredibly important with the work we do. So some of the work I've been doing has to, falls loosely in this orbit of like whistleblowers and organizers and outsiders trying to affect change, I guess, as they challenge like, powerful systemic forces. So I like this idea that, over the years, people have started to kind of regard filmmakers as a little bit of like truth tellers. And I guess that sort of works without patting ourselves on the back. There's a lot of risk and sort of like precarity that we deal with both in production, but I think also in the distribution landscape. There are many decisions that can be made and that impact us directly, but also impact our community. So I'm really eager to talk about this. My most recent long form film was called Crime and Punishment, and that was distributed by Hulu and Roku Films internationally. So grateful to be here. I'm an Asian man in a light blue shirt next to a bookshelf, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emma and Stephen. So I skipped over my audio description. I'm a Chinese woman with shoulder length dark hair with glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a blurred background. So I think that we should just dig into it. And I think what I'll do is start with sharing my screen. And I like to just start with kind of the top objectives, the top considerations when you head into a distribution situation. And what that can be is you have a film that's getting ready to go onto the festival circuit. You're looking for a sales agent. You're negotiating a distribution contract. And something that is very unique to documentary film, I think, is that you're oftentimes negotiating distribution contracts when you're in development. So that is especially the case for emerging BIPOC filmmakers, where they might find development money, which is hard to find, but they might find development money through, the Multicultural Alliance, I think that's what it's called now, through the PBS network, where development funding, $20,000 or $40,000, is tied to your broadcast rights. So it is and I cannot stress it enough, it's incredibly important to start thinking about distribution at the beginning. And so that's where we like to start, is the projects that are any phase, financing to sales to you're already in distribution. This cheat sheet is meant to apply for all of that. So let's start with number one. And what I will do is read the paragraph. I'll talk about it and reframe it in my language. And then I'll open it up to Emma and Stephen to comment on how they've approached this and what this means in the lens of their own experience. So first, objectives, which is the most important place to start and a place where you may continually come back to. It is always a good idea to align expectations with your team, especially before you go into a sales or negotiation situation. Prioritize your objectives. Is it reaching as wide an audience as possible? Is it reaching specific audiences? Is it maximum revenue generation? Is it increasing the brand of the filmmaker? Is it raising awareness and impacting policy? So these are some examples of the objectives that we hear a lot from filmmakers, what they want to get out of distribution. I would say in my experience of working around the world, there's one universal desire amongst all filmmakers, and that is a desire for audience. So beyond that, what is it that you want to prioritize? Because when you go into a negotiation, that's what you want to negotiate from, is your priorities for the outcome of distribution. Is it as high of a sales advance as possible? Is it getting in front of as many people as possible, as many viewers as possible? Is it really focusing on the impact goals that you've set for your project? So this is a conversation I think it's important to start at the very beginning and to continue to revisit, because those priorities might shift with new information, with new team members, with changes in global circumstances, all of that. So I'm going to stop sharing this. So that's a pretty broad place to start. But I would love, Emma, Stephen, if you can comment on us, how has that process been for you? Is that a process you've found yourself engaging in from the beginning? Is this a conversation that's hard to have with the team? What does it look like for you?
You want to start? Should I jump in?
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at it. I mean, I think these are really good bullet points to have an awareness of, right? And as you say, as you prioritize, I think it's also something I've encountered with Crime and Punishment, for example, was that there were cases where I think the motivations of the companies we're dealing with kind of reveal themselves in the negotiation process, and that you realize while you have a set of priorities, those are actually in relationship to a sometimes competing set of priorities that the companies you speak to are concerned about. And so I found it very challenging at times to say, hey, like, we're very interested in making sure something meaningful is done with like educational community rights and things like that, and to kind of in some meetings sort of be given very stock answers. In other cases, to be in a situation where a distributor, will suggest that they love the work you're doing, but would you be open to changing it and re-editing it? And so I think these ideas of like creative control are being really tussled with, and the line is becoming very blurry in distribution meetings, where companies are assuming that filmmakers are not in a position of power. And so I think as we weigh, these questions about how much, how important is it to kind of be whole with our investors and to recoup our debt, and also maximize the number of eyeballs looking at the work we're making. I think it's also about the question is like, can holding these companies accountable and pushing back and showing strength as filmmakers, part of a community that feels similarly, can that also be a part of the objectives? So.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I think what Steve was just saying also about, thinking about recoupment, that relates to what, you were saying, Karen, about just the idea of having these conversations from the very beginning, because I do think it impacts the strategy you take as far as like, are you taking equity finance for your project? Do you want to then be beholden to, pressures perhaps to try to recoup and thinking about the sale? I'll say that with What We Leave Behind, that was an entirely grant funded film. So we're in a very fortunate position to sort of, the idea, obviously it's great if you make money on a project, and that, that can support, filmmakers and future endeavors or making this a more sustainably viable career. But I think for us with that film, the fact that it was all grant funded kind of allowed us to have this conversation in a way that was like, well, what just for our goals, what is most meaningful? And I think, in the case of that film, yes, as you said, you want to reach as wide an audience, but I also think it was really about, it was also about the experience even prior to sort of wide distribution. Can we be really screening in person at festivals and have that experience coming out of the pandemic? Like, there was a conversation we had about, do we rush to try to finish the film in time for festivals in 2021, or do we wait a year, because having an in-person experience with viewers and audiences, which is the sort of first stage of distribution, that maybe is really meaningful for a film that's like a personal film that, I think is maybe best experienced in community. So that was a piece of things. I mean, I think also just the conversation about, this was a first-time film for Ileana, and so, as a goal, how can you position this to sort of build a reputation for her as a filmmaker? And so that's, sort of as part and parcel of distribution, that's like the publicity, the visibility. I think like the awards conversation is very, very silly in a lot of ways, and very political and very, money driven. And I think it's a rigged system. At the same time, there are the realities that, like, working with someone who, or finding the team to be able to push it in certain ways, it does signal that this is a type of film that should be taken seriously or as part of the conversation, which is, I think, frankly, valuable both as, kind of validating a certain kind of work that maybe, varies from the, very, very sort of like mainstream narrative driven kinds of films. It's saying like films that are not sort of following those molds can be taken seriously and be a part of this conversation as well. And then I think the other part of that is, again, just opening opportunities for us as filmmakers, that's part of, what participating in that process does as well. So, there's other films that I worked on where the impact goals were much more baked in to the distribution goals from the beginning, where, what are the specific communities we're trying to reach? What are the calls to action that are part of this? How are we building out those partners from the very beginning? And I think in some ways like that, in the negotiations with distributors, as Steve was saying, like that's something to be very mindful of. Are you still able to maintain, if that's not something they're prioritizing, is that something that you can maintain some sort of autonomy and agency over? Because in a lot of ways, I think filmmakers are often, better positioned to reach those communities and audiences, and because they had those goals in mind the whole time while they were making the film, whereas the distributor doesn't necessarily. So yeah, I think it's ranged, but I think having that conversation sooner rather than later is so important. There's a film that I'm producing now that is in production. It's has some soft money behind it, so some grant money, but is mostly funded in equity finance. And so that from the very beginning in the conversation with the financiers, as part of those negotiation processes, knowing that the financiers, in these contracts, it's like they have, especially if they are funding the majority of a production, they are going to be having say, if not control. I mean, there's ways to negotiate these things over, which sales offer you're choosing to accept. I think having the conversation about goals, both internally with the team and with those potential partners early on, becomes even more important, because it's, if someone, and this was I think in some ways like a reason that certain partnerships didn't feel right for potential finance for this new film, because it, for example, like, I don't think for us as filmmakers, this is director Elizabeth Lowe, like that her number one desire isn't necessarily to sell the film for the most money. And so do you want to find the partner that understands that and what audiences you're trying to reach and what success for that film would look like? So yeah, I think it's variable every time.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think what really strikes me is that the distribution priorities for both of the films you guys talked about comes actually from the DNA. It's like innately tied to the DNA of the film itself. So if you have a film, Crime and Punishment, one of your priorities sounds like it became the ethics and the care that a distributor approached the film with. Just what was it like in the room with them and those conversations, and what did they express? And with Emma, it sounds like the financing DNA of your film allowed you to deprioritize recoupment and then prioritize reaching as wide an audience as possible, or building the filmmaker brand. That is, that's a great position to be in too. It's not easy, but I have a fiction film that is in that position, that is completely grant financed. And that has put us in a position for sales and distribution where our priority is serving the community of the film, so that it just helps in terms of the team all being on the same page and making decisions down the road. Okay, great. I'd love to go to number 2 on our list. And also for those listening in, please populate the chat with any similar experiences that you've had or any questions you have. We will probably go through the first 3 considerations, and then we'll pause and look at what the questions are and see if it's a good time to address. And okay, so I'll go back to the share. And so the second consideration we have here is something that Stephen already touched on, which is know your speaking position. So distribution offers to acquire independent films are increasingly rare in our current saturated, and I would say consolidated, marketplace. Nevertheless, if a distributor is interested in your film, remember you have power as the creator. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Negotiate for terms that suit your needs. Don't be afraid to walk away from the deal, even if there are no other offers. In the long run, you may be better off retaining rights, all of your rights, than being stuck with a distributor who you're unhappy with. Self-distribution and service deals are other pathways, though they also require resources of capital, time, and labor. Consider reviewing existing case studies to learn more on these options. So this is very much hopefully a useful reminder to the power that we have, and a nod in several directions. So it's a nod to the fact that the market is constantly changing. If there's not a buyer now, or there's not a pathway now, there might be one that opens up in a year. So that is a shorter time to wait than signing a contract for 10 to 20 years that you're not happy with. The other nod we're trying to make in this paragraph is the idea that everything is negotiable, right? Except maybe like E&O insurance. But in terms of like the terms of your distribution deal, if that's all you take away from this webinar, that is a powerful takeaway. If you walk into a sales and distribution situation thinking everything is negotiable, that is a powerful place to start from. And the other nod we are trying to make is a reframing around this idea of self-distribution, which has been rebranded as creative distribution. And that is because distribution advocates has come to see that as somewhat of a divide and conquer model that the industry has used with independent filmmakers, that this is the alternative, is self-distribution, and there is an industry of consultants and service companies who will help you do that. But that's only a pathway that's available to people who are already in a space of having the resources, having the capital, having the time, having the labor to put something through self-distribution. I did it twice in the early 2000s for Asian American cinema when there was no buyer interest in that. And it is a lot of work. I am grateful because I learned distribution because of that. But it is a recognition that that's not the golden alternative. It is just another one of your options that you need to look at very closely. So in this number 2 consideration, Emma and Stephen, I wonder if there's anything you want to share on any of those threads in terms of an experience where you realized perhaps you had more power than you thought you had going into a distribution situation, or if you've ever looked at or taken on self-distribution, or where you have found that waiting was perhaps better than signing something that wasn't fair.
Well, I'll just say, I'm glad you said that about the fact that, self-distribution, creative distribution isn't necessarily, the perfect golden alternative, to use your words. Although I think, I think that what that was making me think of is, so I mentioned on Unrest, which, I wasn't the lead producer on that. I was an associate producer. That was one of the first projects that I'd worked on that had, a full, robust team. But I think for me, it was this kind of eye-opening experience because, I think at the time there was several staff members, several, associate producers, screening coordinator, producer, that were sort of there to execute because it was a full-time job for multiple people to be doing that work. And so, and that was with the support of the Sundance Fellowship, that was with certain, pieces of the the sort of distribution on top of what we were doing internally as a team, working with partners like Netflix and Independent Lens. But I think a conversation, even with What We Leave Behind, when we were sort of considering, what happens if we don't find distribution for this film? What does that look like to do the work of making sure this gets seen ourselves? I think that, there's also a necessity of sort of recognizing the limitations and the desires of your team as far as what that entails: time, labor, potentially keeping you from working on future projects. And I think for some people, like in a certain moment, I think that can be great. That can be exciting. You learn so much, you connect directly with audiences, you can realize your goals. I think with this film, a conversation we had was, look, would we be happy if we did, a really sort of robust festival screening, festival life, work to maybe do some work with an educational distributor, get some educational screenings booked, figure out some community screenings, but then kind of let it lie, because we don't necessarily want as a team to take on, another year, 2 years of working on distributing this film ourselves. So I think that's maybe not I think you were asking, Karen, like, when is it that you're realizing you have more power? And so I'm not answering that in the sense of like, if you don't have the deal from the distributor, or if the deal from the distributor isn't perfect, like, are you empowered to walk away? I think, in our case, we were sort of thinking to ourselves, well, also, what might you be willing to compromise if you know that there's certain limitations or lack of desire on your part to put certain labor in, because there's other opportunities to be working on films, or because you want the film seen, but like would be okay if it's only within certain constraints, if it allows you to go on and do more work as a filmmaker sooner. So I think there's just, again, like, this is maybe like a broken record that I'm gonna keep reiterating, but just like having those conversations really clearly with the other members of your team about what, because there's a world where Ileana might have said, okay, look, if we don't get a distribution deal that we are really happy with, we would need to get someone, if I didn't have the bandwidth as a producer, or, neither of us were in the position to be able to do that work of self-distribution, who do we work with to ensure that that happens outside of what offer is on the table? And so, I think, again, it's just kind of like making sure that the expectations are there, and you're on the same page with your collaborators. But yeah, I mean, I think that even with something like What We Leave Behind, to speak frankly, like, that it wasn't a film where we had a ton of, distributors knocking down our door. It's a Spanish language, quiet, personal film. It's 71 minutes. It's definitely, it's not like a big commercial film, and we knew that from the beginning. And so, there was a couple of offers that we were considering, but even with that, we had the negotiations with Array, who ended up acquiring it. Like, they went on for a while because we wanted to make sure that even with what they were saying is the way that they typically worked, and the terms that they could offer, that they really served the film. And I think, again, knowing that we had talked through what the alternatives were and how we could ensure the film's success, or ensure that we were meeting the goals, we knew what those plan Bs, what those plan Cs were. I think that empowered us to, via our lawyer, like, push back on certain things and see where we could push them, even without having, like a hot bidding war between buyers, or, a ton of other offers on the table, because we knew what success could look like for us in other ways.
Can I ask one quick question, Emma? How did you get your film in front of Array?
Yeah, so I know that there's a point on this sheet later about sales agents, but we weren't able to get a sales agent for this film. And, that is, so, just in case there's folks who are watching who don't know, often, or usually what will happen is, you'll work with a sales agent who will be the one kind of, taking the film to different buyers, and they're the ones negotiating on your behalf, and potentially like driving up the price or certain terms. And we, in advance of our we'd had conversations with different sales agents earlier on, participated in like the Gotham Week and certain industry events where you meet sales agents and they're kind of tracking the film. And so we'd had a number of contacts where there's a lot of like, come back to us when you are a little bit farther along, or come back to us when, we know what happens with the festival premiere. And so we got into South by Southwest as our world premiere. And so that's exciting. That's a festival where, there is an industry and a marketplace, ostensibly, behind it. And so that became another wave of outreach on our behalf. And no sales agent was willing to take it on. And I think, there was a lot of like, we think this is really beautiful, we really love this, we just can't in this current marketplace. And so part of that, I understand in the sense of the way that sales agents operate, is they're taking, they're taking a commission on the film. So if they're doing the calculation of how much is this film going to sell for, how much time am I going to put into this, how many buyers are actually buying films right now, again, there's a lot, I think, just in terms of ticking the boxes of what's buzzy and commercial. I don't think this film fits that, but I think we felt very confident that like, this is a film that is going to connect with audiences. There's themes that are really universal. It's about legacy and aging and grief and family and connection. And, and then we had this really successful launch at South by Southwest, and won. There's 2 awards that we won, and festival added another screening. And we were finding, I think, that people had been quick to pigeonhole, like, this is a film that's going to just resonate with Latinx viewers, because it's made by a Mexican-American filmmaker. It's about, it's in Spanish, but we were finding that, the people that were, reacting to it, it's people talking about their Jewish grandmother, or people talking about, their own experience with family during the pandemic. But, I think that again empowered us to just be like, okay, well, we don't have someone advocating for the film in a formal way to do sales, but like, we do believe in this thing. We think there's an audience. And so truly, we just reached out to buyers directly, including to Array. And so some of that was to invite them to screenings, to the South by premiere. And then, even after that, for folks who weren't able to come, I mean, the Array they didn't attend the premiere, but I think being able to reach out and say, here's some reviews, this is how the film was received, here, please take a look at this trailer. And I think they were a company, given that, their prioritization is women and underrepresented filmmakers, BIPOC filmmakers in particular. They saw it and they connected with it. But that truly was just like us kind of being like, hey, pay attention, please pay attention to us. I think, I don't know how often that, that works, but I do think that like the entire process, and I think even after Array has come on board, I do feel like as independent filmmakers, particularly independent filmmakers, without a tremendous amount of resources behind them, you have to kind of be doing this the whole time and like really believe that you have something that's worth paying attention to. So, I mean, I think we were lucky, but also like worked to make that happen,
That's incredible to me that you did not have a sales agent for such an amazing, incredible film. I think that really speaks to the kind of like the zeitgeist of the distribution landscape, right? Like a term that a colleague shared with me that I've also heard bandied about in distribution meetings is the word watchable, right? It's like the distributors want something that's just watchable. It's the lowest common denominator that presumes there's nothing too exciting about films that are going to push the norms or filmmakers that are going to challenge our expectations in programming. And it's I think it's a real problem, right? There's this like the way the distribution is going, is a direct challenge to the art of nonfiction, saying that artful films can't be entertaining, or entertaining films that have a social issue can't be artful, and that you can never have it all at once. And I think that we have to go into these meetings, especially when we're receiving kind of like pushback or even aggressive terms or antagonistic kind of framing and terms. I think we have to, as filmmakers, take very, like valued-based stances that speak not just to a defense of the work, but a defense of like our vision for this community that we and industry that we want to work in. Because I think the biggest problem is that the companies do not have the same values and the same agenda as we do. And when you frame the conversation at the earliest stages, ideally with a good sales agent, right, as your advocate, but also as the filmmakers, I think it sets a tone that allows you to weed out and walk away from, bad deals. I think that is one of the most powerful cards we can play, is to just know that we don't have to be desperate for the deals, that self-distribution is incredibly challenging. It's, I had to do a hybrid distribution with High Tech Low Life, but I was grateful to do it. But I think in the end, it allows us to then at least land with partners who are going to understand when an issue in the life of the film really matters. Because it's not like just the point of sale that you are trying to suss a deal out for. It's a years long relationship. There was a moment in my relationship with Hulu when we were distributing it with Crime and Punishment that an important holiday had come up. They had not included any mention of my film in this holiday, on Juneteenth, and I called them up immediately. I was like, what is going on here? And because they knew how much, my contact there, Belisa Bellyband is, did I get that right? Anyway, Belisa, who was really an advocate for the film and was committed to doing as much as she could. It was we were able to to work around that, you know, that mistake, frankly, and they were able to do a special release with us. And that was, I think, only because I knew enough at that point, you know, my second time around doing a distribution deal, that you have to come in strong and be willing to scare away some deals, actually. I really feel like that also is it kind of like it's part of this ethos that I've been learning, you know, now later in my career, that it's not about the distributors getting to know us and our needs and our interests, or not us getting to know them, but it's them getting to know us, is what I meant to say. That, you know, we're not trying to figure out how do we become more attractive to distributors. It's the other way around. They have to understand that we have what they need, which they just deem as content. We're just content creators filling up libraries and programming slates. But in fact, we are the driving machine behind these companies, that gives them credibility, that brings them awards that they so deeply care about, and allows them to thrive and engage with us. And, you know, we see them everywhere in our, you know, at events, and we are having cocktails with them. And there are many great people working in distribution, you know, filmmakers who have taken jobs who have shared values. But I think we have to really be honest with ourselves that at the end of the day, the companies have such a strong driving motivation to recoup revenue, period. And then all the other stuff. And that is a real inverse of priorities for us. So yeah, I really, I don't know, I can't stress enough that I think we're making decisions not just for our films in the moment, but actually for the future of our work with these companies and others, and also for the kind of like health of our community.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, Stephen. I wish every filmmaker could have a 5-minute pep talk with you before they go into a meeting with a distributor. I appreciate both of your very specific stories of how you were your own advocate. You advocated on behalf of your own films in the distribution process. That's really key. And I think that's a process that filmmakers don't like. It's just not a concept everybody understands that they need to do. So that actually leads directly to our third point. And so let's review the third point together and talk about it, and then we'll go into a lot of the questions that have been coming up. All right, so I'll just share this again. Oh, 1 second, sorry. Okay. Okay, so the third point is, what is a distributor? And it seems funny we have to put this on here, but we do, because we started to realize many people, not just filmmakers, but funders, everybody did not know what a distributor was. And that is partly because of the lack of information that's available, but it's largely because there's been a complete vertical integration of distribution with every other part of filmmaking. So vertical integration means when one company holds all of the means to make and distribute something from beginning to end. So that used to be a separated process. We used to have production and financing and distribution and then exhibition, but now that's all become kind of one company. And even those companies have consolidated within themselves. So teasing out what exactly is distribution is key to an understanding. So what is a distributor? A distributor is an entity that will sell, license, or rent your film through existing relationships with exhibition platforms. So just to say, an exhibition platform is a physical or virtual space where your film is shown. So that's a movie theater, that's a streaming platform, that's a microcinema. That is what an exhibitor is. A distributor creates and delivers the technical and marketing assets to the exhibitors. A distributor is responsible for the visibility of the film to an audience using publicity and marketing. Distributors take a percentage of the revenue and they charge for marketing expenses and delivery expenses. A distributor can offer a sales advance, or what's also called a minimum guarantee on sales, which is then recouped from your revenue. So here's our note on expectations. A distributor does not solve all your problems. Do not expect to hand your film to a distributor and walk away. Expect to do the work necessary still to reach audiences, even if you have a distributor. So Stephen's story was, perfect for this point. And so let me just break that down further, because I find it sometimes helpful to just understand, I would say, maybe the proportion of work that a distributor does in relation to its responsibilities. So we can say a distributor has three main responsibilities. Number one is curation or acquisitions, right? Number two is delivery and relationships with the exhibitors, right? That's booking your film at a movie theater, for example. And number three is marketing. So if you look at the breakdown of resources of how that is managed within most distribution companies, the majority of the resources for a theatrical distributor, for example, goes towards marketing. And the least amount of resources oftentimes goes towards curation. So what does that mean? That means you will find most distributors attending the same 6 film festivals to look for content, to look for films. So that is how we are in a situation where the festivals have become part of the marketplace, because distributors rely on, in my perspective, distributors rely on those programming teams as part of their content and acquisitions teams. So this is a huge part of the conversation that I tried to tease out that part, because it helps us look at why are we all trying to get into the same 5 or 6 film festivals, and why are distributors only going to those film festivals? Where do those resources actually go? And again, this goes back to Stephen's point, is that a distribution company is there to make money. It's there to generate profit. So a large part of what they do is in the marketing of it, creating that visibility. And oftentimes, so for example, I had a film that sold at Sundance. The marketing team had to see it before they put an offer down on the film. So we had to rush, a print back then, to the marketing team to watch. And the marketing spend, what they will spend on the marketing of your release, is became a huge part of our negotiation, actually. So the other thing I just want to clarify for people is this idea of sales advance. So when you hear that a film sold for $5 million or $1 million at Sundance, what that is actually an advance on your sales, which is like asking for an advance on your paycheck. That money, you might get that money 2 weeks in advance, but it's going to come out of the paycheck you get in 2 weeks. So anything that you get as a sales advance or a minimum guarantee is paid for out of your revenue in distribution. So, all right. And then Stephen, I know that that's also kind of broad and vague topic, but are there experiences or things you like to add, to any of those points?
Gosh, one thing that it's a little off topic actually that I think is an interesting phenomenon is that like we chase after deals with companies we think will cultivate our careers. And I think that's really a falsehood, that the closest thing you're going to see quite very often is that you make a work, perhaps it does well at some festivals, and then you are being courted with now the ideal sort of deal scenario for these streamers and companies, which is to hire you as a work for hire or have you do commission film work, where now you're fully disempowered as a filmmaker. I spent 7 years in total developing relationships and making multiple different early versions of Crime and Punishment, which which led to the final film. And then as soon as we were done, countless inquiries like, could you do a version of that on this other subject in 6 months for this, unworkable, probably ultimately inhumane budget? And there were so many offers that actually made me really feel so cynical that like, oh wow, this is kind of what a modicum of critical success leads to, which is entry into a world where now these companies are going to invite you to play on their terms more than your terms, even more so. And so I found that kind of fascinating and revealing that, we have to really, like you said, like know your position when you go into these deals. I just wanted to add that quickly.
Yeah.
And not to chase after those sorts of, alluring, potential interests from companies that we think might cultivate our careers. I think we are singularly going to be the ones who have to define the arc of that, or else you are going to be making a lot of work for hire projects that frankly make you feel bad about the work you do. Because lately I've heard nothing but horror stories from dozens and dozens of filmmakers, colleagues and friends who have been trying out this kind of work for hire commission filmmaking process with the streamers. And it's, with very mixed reviews.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks, Steve, to like there's kind of like what's the expression, like the snake eating its own tail a little bit. Like it's the flattening that happens, where it's like, if that becomes the thing that's deemed success, but then, what content is being commissioned is determined by these forces outside the filmmakers. And then that's what those filmmakers are doing. And then that opens up other doors in turn. I think it just results in the squeeze that we're seeing in every facet of things. So I appreciate you saying that, because I do think that kind of like shiny work for hire, where it's not I had to hustle for 7 years to get this project done without resources and support. Like that is, I think that can seem sometimes to filmmakers like the shiny carrot that's being dangled. Like, what, someone's going to pay me from the beginning to do this work that I want to do, but it's sort of on whose terms. And I think that I've heard a lot of stories recently as well about how that process can be both creatively and frankly, sometimes financially disempowering. But I was just going to add to what Karen, you were saying about what parts of the process the distributor is technically handling and what they're not, and being clear about that from the beginning. Because again, I'll cite this specifically with the most recent experience with what we leave behind. Granted, we knew with that Array Releasing is like a nonprofit film company. They are, it's the production company is not, but they're the nonprofit wing that's releasing these sorts of films. So they're not necessarily in the business of trying to make money, but also at the same time, that means there's very limited resources. And so I think it was important to understand. And to be honest, I don't know that I fully understood, even when we were kind of, beginning work with them, just how much they could and couldn't do with certain things, and just how much we as filmmakers were going to have to do ourselves, not just in terms of labor, but in terms of putting our own resources into, building out the team, or we ended up bringing on, they sort of wrapped the publicity work in a lot of ways after the launch of the film. And then it's like, well, felt like there was a lot of other opportunities on the table still. So that was us as filmmakers with money that we still had, hiring the publicists that we'd worked with at South by Southwest ourselves to continue after that first, 3-week window or, month, whatever, that they were sort of pushing the film timed with the Netflix launch, to continue to generate opportunities, buzz, interviews, awards, press, et cetera. Same with social media. I mean, I think that they were great about, during the sort of initial launch and in the lead up, creating assets, pushing the film on their channels. They have a lot of, like a large following, but at the same time, they're also promoting all these other projects that I think in certain ways take priority. And I think that's, often or usually the case with the distributor, because as Steve said, like that they're building libraries of films, and certain projects get the most weight and most push, and other projects don't. And so I think that's something that also potentially like underestimated both the power of and the work entailed in that kind of digital marketing, just to continue to keep it on the radar of the viewers, the industry members, the audiences we were wanting to reach. So yeah, I just I say that not to be disheartening, and I know it really ranges from distributor to distributor, but I guess it's just, I think even in the best case scenario where you have a huge studio with incredible marketing budget and resources and a team behind you, I do still think that you have to continue to do that work for yourself as a filmmaker and be your own advocate. So I think I continue to learn that lesson over and over. Yeah.
I think that's a really great story, because that's something that filmmakers can do and try to plan for, and really makes a big difference, which is to hire an additional publicist or to augment the publicity, because that carries value, I think, beyond just the release. It's also for the filmmaking team and the filmmaker's career. But it really does help with audiences too. And that's something that, like, at my little distribution company, like, we do that sometimes. We'll figure out which films need additional publicity help, and we'll look at bringing that on. And that's something absolutely filmmakers can do. So I think that was really smart that you did that. And it is just the reality of, there's a certain release schedule every distribution company has, and they have to turn their attention every couple weeks, or at least once a month, to the next film, and next and next and next. So it is the marketplace reality. So let's go to the
I just wanted to add, like,
yeah,
can I add one thing?
please.
I really can't connect with that even more, like this idea that you have to be your own advocate. I think that there's something so important about also communicating the nuance to your understanding of your own project to all your partners, right? That they don't know what you care about and what you need unless you continuously express that and hammer away. And I think going in and really vetting potential partners for where they stand. Like these days, I just go in and try and understand, for example, like educational and community screenings should be, I think, always open and non-exclusive. And I think as filmmakers, for example, we should always go in and demand, well, we're going to want non-exclusive rights to that, not the way Netflix used to structure it, where we'll give you like six community screenings or whatever it was, but that it is just an assumption that this needs to happen, because I think that gives us the leeway to then be really creative and fill in gaps, create ground teams, like do real impact work. I know this is a word that really bothers some people, because impact for distributors is really just audience engagement and subscription engagement. And I don't mean to sound antagonistic to the commerce of this. We need the commerce. We need to sell tickets and subscriptions. But I think we have to also be realistic that we do care the most about people seeing the film. And so when I understood that, for example, with like High Tech Low Life, that this was not going to be a film that was going to be easily seen in mainland China. And because I was documenting sort of these like cyberpunks who were using technology to circumvent the Great Firewall and all of this, I used this sort of like this loophole in our educational community screenings to encourage them to pirate the film. And my main protagonist went ahead and just self-distributed it in China himself, and held salon screenings and did countless screenings and events with it, and then just put it all over the Chinese internet as well. And I really appreciated that. Like he did re-edit the film and put in one scene where he's like doing more push-ups in a strange way, but I thought even that was kind of charming. And I like having that as the lore of the film. It's like whatever it takes for the film to be seen where you need it to be seen, that's fine. So yeah.
That's awesome. I love That's real initiative to re-edit and include a scene of yourself exercising.
Yeah.
So let's go to the Q&A. There's a lot of questions. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but let's start. And I wanted to start with the first question. I think that was posted in this kind of Q&A chat box. And it's from Isidore Bethel. And it says, Stephen, you mentioned something about distributors acting as if they wielded all the power in negotiations to the exclusion of filmmaker power. For all three of us, what are ways that you remind yourself of and consolidate your power as filmmakers, especially going into interactions where others might doubt or challenge your power? So what are ways we remind ourselves and consolidate our power? And I know we've touched on this quite a lot, but wanted to put that out there in case there's more you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to belabor it, and I apologize for steering it in that direction if it was a bit too much. But I mean,
Not at all, yeah.
Not at all.
I mean, I think the labor and the treatment of filmmakers, right? How we are regarded for the work we do is directly linked to the behavior of these distributors that we are dealing with, and the streamers and the companies that we are all vying to get attention from. So I think, like, in order to kind of push back against this feeling of like the scarcity of attention and resources, we have to go in and stop, regarding our own work as something that we are desperate to share with this company or that company, and really go in strong. I think we have to go in hard and strong. And I like your point that you put in this distribution spreadsheet. Know our position, know that we're willing to walk away.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think that it's funny. I know Isidore is actually the editor of What We Leave Behind. So I think he is someone who, just in the choices that he's made, is always driven by like what projects really speak to him. And I think it's funny, I've actually learned a lot in working with him about how I, as a producer, can sort of hold on to my own value, like creative compass, intuition about what feels right for the work that I want to make. So it's a mushy answer, but I think it's a combination of conversations like this one, where I think it sort of feels inspiring just to be in solidarity with other filmmakers who are going through this thing. Because I think sometimes the feeling can be that we're pitted against each other or in competition with each other for a scarcity of resources. And I think it's kind of a mindset shift can be really helpful and empowering, that, we all are making, our own art, our own work, where, in each path is different for each filmmaker, and it's not a zero-sum game as much as there's the sort of doom and gloom of so-and-so is only acquiring X number of films and the rest are internal productions or whatever, because that doesn't negate our own ability to make these projects and move this process forward and advocate for ourselves. So yeah, but I think that's an ongoing thing that we all have to remind ourselves of, because there's a lot of forces in the marketplace that work to make us feel otherwise.
And I should have added also that, like, there are so many opportunities to also kind of inspire those that you're sitting across the table from, that there are many people also working in the distribution landscape that want to kind of find this path forward with filmmakers, but they also need to be kind of empowered, right, by this idea that, like, oh wow, like, filmmakers are in a position of power. We need to kind of meet them more than halfway. And so I don't want to make it seem like these are immovable conversations at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how, Emma, you define it as a practice. It's an ongoing practice to cultivate this. And I would second everything you guys have said. I put it down to, filmmakers and producers, but filmmakers, we need allies and we need advocates. And you are your best advocate, but it's really important to find allies and to find advocates. So for me as a producer, my lawyer is a huge advocate. I mean, literally, but also really. So that I think having that kind of knowledge and experience and that kind of ally on your side is also key, because it is a landscape where other teams and other films enter with a huge amount of allies and advocates on their side. Okay, and then so the next question I wanted to go to was the first one I saw come up in the chat, and I may pronounce this name wrong, but it's from Margaret Hoffman. And the question is, more and more, I see that distributors focus more on projects that they finance from the start. Is there a more tried and true route to getting financing from a distributor upfront? And are there any recommended pathways to getting distribution once a film is finished? Thanks so much. So I think this question really encapsulates the kind of conundrum or dilemma that most independent filmmakers are facing right now, which is, you know, this thing that I think, Stephen, you talked really well to, which is our relationship as filmmakers, our relationship to distributors has changed dramatically in recent years, because distributors have now become financiers, and now everything's vertically integrated. So you're forced to have this very different relationship now with who distributes your film and how that affects your career going forward. And what that has meant is the vertical integration has meant that, you know, A24, I think they financed 18 films this year and they acquired 3. So the space for acquisitions is now super narrow. And it's not just independent filmmakers who are worrying about this. It's every equity investor. That's even the big equity investors are worried, because if you are independently financing something up front, what is the reality of, or what are the odds and chances of an acquisition? So there's a lot packed into this question, but would you guys like to address it from any angle?
I mean, the basic distinction is that as soon as a financier comes on board, or a distributor, you know, comes on board with the majority contribution to your budget, it sounds like it will be commissioned work to some degree, or a work for hire. And so you're relinquishing a tremendous amount of creative control. And how do you feel about that? You know, for some projects, that is totally fine, because you're not going to run into some of these ethical dilemmas or journalistic questions or representational issues that for you have a tremendous amount of nuance. For others, it may seem a little bit of like a, you know, who cares? So I think it really depends project to project.
Yeah, and I think it's a balance. I think it's easier for me to say as a producer who's perhaps able to do more projects at a time than, you know, a director who's sort of all in on one thing. But I think sometimes it's a balance is what I'm finding, where it's as you're sort of building out a slate of, you know, what are the things that are a little bit like you're gambling, I think, in both directions, whether you decide to work with a, you know, you're working with a buyer who's commissioning something right from the beginning. And then, you know, as Stephen says, like, you don't necessarily have the same control, or you're not the one that's going to be able to drive the process the way that you would, you know, if you were retaining independence. The same time, it's a gamble if you, you know, are producing it independently and then hoping to you know, sell it at the end and find the right home for it, as we've been discussing. So I think, you know, certain projects, it makes sense to go in either direction. And I think that, again, as a producer, it's a little bit easier, I think, to say, hey, this is a project that I think would make sense to get those partners on board early. We know what it is. That, I guess that's something that I would add, is that my experience both on the exec side and on the producer side has been that, you know, the projects that are easier to sort of pitch and sell at an earlier stage are those projects where it's not necessarily like, here's an unfolding story that we're kind of going on this journey as a film team, and we don't necessarily know exactly what the neat act 3 is going to be and where we're going to end up. And you can't necessarily answer all the questions that a buyer is going to try to poke holes in from the very beginning. And I think, frankly, like there, you know, I would say a film like What We Leave Behind, or, you know, many of the kinds of projects I admire, where it feels like filmmaking as a mode of inquiry, or it feels like, you know, there is some kind of journey of discovery that's happening over the course of making the project. You can't have predicted that when you're saying this is what the film is from the very beginning. Look at my deck, right? And so I think in some ways that's why you tend to see the the streamers, like the things that they're commissioning tend to, if it's the true crime, like rehashing of a story that's already out there, or it's the conversion of a piece of IP where you already know what that means. This is the beginning, middle, and end, and we just need these 10 interview subjects to speak to it. It's easier to, it's like less of a risk in a lot of ways for them to commission something like that than something that's a little bit more amorphous and harder to define. So that's generalizing, but I think that, there's sort of different lanes that make more sense for different projects for that reason.
I mean, it's interesting that like, oh, so
good
sorry.
point. I was just going to say that's a really good point. Like an answer might be true crime is a tried and true route to getting financing from a distributor up front. But Stephen, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say it's really interesting that these kinds of films that are cinematic experiences that are based, like rooted in a kind of like maybe imagery that does not yet exist about this kind of story, are the films that maybe, like, if you could just get through the grant funding process, will potentially be among projects that the distributors are most excited about, but they're the ones they will run away from first when presented as a pitch. And so, because it's unfamiliar, right? There's no guarantee of that. And so if there's any way to, really tap deeply into the soft money funding landscape as much as possible, until you arrive at a really substantial moment within your unfolding story, then you can really possibly position yourself to do either, at a point in the making of the work where you will also have much more control over what that equity financing looks like if you do go that route.
This is maybe, derailing us in too much of one direction, but I did want to say, I think that, like, if there's one thing that I wish that there was more of, and I you said curation earlier, Karen, but I really feel like there needs to be more sources for early stage money, for films. And that's, even development funds, often you need to have materials that you've shot already to show. You need to have identified, this is what I envision the story to be. And I think it makes it really, really hard to sort of maintain that power, that independence, to get to a stage where you, as you said, Steve, like, have something to present that can make the case, because, so often you're just having to float yourself to get to that point. And even, again, having worked as a development exec at a company with money, it's like, I was often in the position of having to say, really interested, can you come back when you have more? And that was for development, right? And that's really frustrating for filmmakers, because where are they supposed to get the resources to be able to get more? So anyway, that's an aside, but
I can tell you how many times I've been told that over the years.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Emma. I couldn't agree more. I am, other than my distribution kind of work, I really try to talk to funders and also possibly venture capital about creating development funds, because especially in documentary, I mean, I said this up front, but it really is, it's a reality that BIPOC filmmakers, especially first-time filmmakers, they can only access development funding if they give up distribution rights, or at the very least, a first look on their broadcast rights, right? So that is the primary source of development. So that already puts the project and the filmmaker at a disadvantage when it comes to sales and distribution. We have time for a few more, and I wanted to go to maybe pick a couple like very questions that are very specific, because we had some that were quite broad. So this is one from Victoria Bruce, and the question is, we were approached by a producer's rep. And so anybody who doesn't know, a producer's rep is like a domestic version of a sales agent, someone who reps the sales on a film on behalf of the producers. So we were approached by a producer's rep who wanted $4,000 to represent our film. What are your thoughts on these types of arrangements? The film was Blood, Sweat, and Honey, which has been around for a long time and obviously a legit organization, but I've never had an agent who was paid upfront.
I mean, that's not much of a vote of confidence. I don't know. I feel like there's, so much to be said for the excitement level that somebody comes into the meeting with. So it doesn't sound like they're very thrilled to be working with you.
I'm not sure if this was like after a festival announcement, but without naming names, I believe I'm familiar with this company, and I think I've received in the past emails from them where it sort of seems like as soon as the announcement comes up about a lineup at a particular festival, that gets blasted out to all the films. And I don't say that to say like, oh, it's not a particular interest in your film, but that's something to interrogate. Because there's I think that there's filmmakers that might fall into that trap of working with someone who isn't actually positioned to be the best advocate for them.
Yeah, the person who asked the question said that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, in general, I would say walk away from that. If like an upfront payment is not standard. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know anybody who has done it and has had something positive to say. So until then, I will say really interrogate it, as Emma has said. The next question is from Louise and says, once/if you find distribution on streaming services, are filmmakers usually assured of viewership info and the demographics if they track it? So, no.
This is so frustrating. I mean, certainly I'll speak to with Netflix, black box, unless you're in the top 10, that was kind of the concession that they made to filmmakers and producers in recent years is, you can go to the top 10 page and they'll give you metrics, but only for those films that are placing in the top 10 of a specific country. So otherwise, I mean, there's no, at least my experience has been, there's no sense of how a project is performing. And that's not something that, I found it possible to negotiate, which is really, really frustrating.
I know we need some intrepid hackers to go in and just get us the data so that it demystifies sort of the value of this, as IP. I'm sort of kidding, but it is very strange, right? Like what a valuable relationship. And yet the thing that they're making the most critical decisions based on is something that they won't reveal to their own filmmakers. That's got to change. I mean, it's just bullshit.
Yeah, so that's a clear no. Thank you for answering that honestly, from your experiences. Maybe we have time for one more, which is from John Brick, and it says, can you give your thoughts on the future of using FilmHub and other aggregators for distribution? So this is actually a point on our cheat sheet, which I think maybe, we have a few minutes and I would love to go over that. And I don't know, Stephen and Emma, if you have experience with aggregators, but I think, okay, so let's go through that distinction quickly, because I think it's helpful, and then maybe share some thoughts on it. So thank you, John, for asking that question. So what is an aggregator or a digital distributor? So just to say, an aggregator is something that started very early on with streaming services, like in the 2000s, and they have since been rebranded as digital distributors. So there is really confusion in that word. So it's important to know what an aggregator actually does. So many VOD platforms will only accept films through an aggregator or a distributor. Aggregators take an upfront fee and they deliver your film to these VOD platforms. Current examples are Bitmax and Quiver. A recent shift has seen companies that started as aggregators now rebrand as digital distributors. They may release a small number of films theatrically, but they focus on digital exhibition platforms, and they spend much less on marketing and securing non-digital exhibition. Digital distributors take a percentage of your revenue. So there's a clear distinction between the revenue model In the beginning, aggregators would take 20%. So someone that's veering into taking 40% is in distribution company territory. And in general, these aggregators now, they charge an upfront fee, which includes the cost of the technical delivery. And in those cases, there's no spend on marketing. It's really a very different work process. But in order to get onto certain platforms, like for example, transactional VOD, there's one kind of mother of all TVOD platforms, and that's iTunes. So to get onto iTunes, you have to go through an aggregator if you don't have a distributor. Okay, and yeah, Stephen and Emma, do you have thoughts about aggregators and have you worked with them?
I mean, I have a limited experience in this, and it was at a time where I feel like the distribution landscape was so different. So this was what, circa 2017, and it was with Unrest, where I think just windowing different pieces of distribution was possible in a way that I just don't know if it's possible in the same way now. Karen, you could speak to that more than I could, but we worked with, I believe it was Quiver, in order to get the film on iTunes, as you said, and but it wasn't the one. It wasn't the one distribution channel that we were pursuing. That was just for the TVOD, and that was prior to the Netflix release and the broadcast. The broadcast was before that. So I think one thing that maybe is different now. I think as you were saying, like there's definitely during the pandemic, I think there is potentially some blurriness that happened with some of those platforms where like the digital distribution was what the distributors were doing. It wasn't it wasn't also theatrical. It became like virtual cinemas, and I think some of that I don't know, there were shifts in the way some of those companies operated, but I do think that the reason that was really helpful for us with Unrest was because we had these other pieces of things where we were doing the marketing and the publicity, and we weren't reliant on just the TVOD piece of things for anything beyond just making the film available for sort of an additional revenue stream. But I don't have a lot of expertise in this, so I don't know if Steve, you've had experience with an aggregator.
I don't really directly. I mean, after our POV broadcast and the output deal with Netflix expired for High Tech Low Life, I believe Chris Horton at Sundance he was doing this creative distribution initiative, I think it was, and he was working with aggregators, and I actually thought it was an amazing program where it was really like a beta test, I guess, and I was so sad to hear that had gone away, because it really did give another life to our film when I just didn't have any bandwidth. Our very tiny team did not have the resources, the manpower to breathe more distribution life into this project. And, because we're trying to make other work, and it is a tremendous amount of time that has to be put in to just lock in one deal. So I think like this, there's so much opportunity here in this, this area that somebody should tap into.
Yeah, I think that there seems to be a trend back towards TVOD, where just anecdotally, I've heard of a lot of people canceling their streaming subscriptions and just paying on transactional VOD for what they want to watch. So that's a really interesting trend, especially as we head into a recession. But to see how that changes things, and also AVOD, right, and the idea of fast channels, I think that's been a result of the streaming wars. We just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to just open it up to both of you if there are kind of any last things you would like to say, or anything that you didn't get a chance to say, or just parting words to leave our audience with.
I mean, maybe this is Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that, if the tenor of this conversation has been maybe a little bit cynical about the current landscape of things, I really do believe that these things like can and will swing and correct themselves. And I think that, there's a bubble that we've been in with some of the, as you said, the consolidation of some of these platforms and buyers. And I I don't know, I'm really hopeful that there is going to be something that bursts and changes and ushers in a whole new way of doing things, because I don't think that the way that we are operating right now is sustainable or really works for the artists. And this doesn't, this, as Steve said, there is none of this without those who are making the work. So I think that the more that we're talking openly about what does and doesn't work for us, and we're sharing terms of these deals and what this process was, and we're not reinventing the wheel every time, and there's shared resources and contacts, like I think the more we empower ourselves to be able to shift for, push for that change, or even for some of our allies on the distribution side to identify where those holes are that need to be filled. So that's my hopeful note.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have a lot of strong opinions about this, and maybe it might be because of the recent work I've been doing on documenting the unionization efforts at Amazon. And that will be an interesting distribution project, because clearly Amazon will not be very excited about taking it on, or any companies that have strong output deals with them. So it's really been actually quite empowering and liberating in a way that reminds me, like, well, look, like, in the face of capitalism, and it runs rampant in our industry and our community, the only antidote we have to push back is radical kind of transparency, honesty about how we feel about these forces, and then to use our collective power as a community that talks and shares information and tries to find common sort of ground on this. I mean, I'm sure many people will not agree with anything I say, but at least as long as we're talking about these things, then that's really important, because I don't think this industry will ever correct itself, ever, unless you make noise, push back, and really, really threatens to kind of like, go on strike, so to speak, and restrict the access to your work in some ways. And with the conditions of making sure that these people that we are, all of these partners we're working with really understand the filmmaking community is moving in this direction, and the industry is moving in another, and it's putting us in a very difficult situation, where I think a lot of filmmakers are kind of fed up with saying, like, well, if I just get through these years, then the next project I'll be able to kind of keep up with my bills, and that sort of mentality of scarcity. So I guess I feel a little bit like I'm less afraid now to vent my frustrations about this subject, and I'm feeling like, for better or worse, it's the kind of conversation that I hope we can hear more of, because it would have been very instructive to me many years ago.
Yeah, I really appreciate how much you've shared from everything you've learned the hard way, both of you. Thank you. It seems to be one of the ways through distribution, but I do want to underscore what you said, Steve, that I think a way forward is solidarity. I think solidarity is the path, and it's so important for us to hold on to as filmmakers, because distribution is the space where we are told there's only a handful of us allowed at the table. So that's kind of, I think, the first construct to interrogate. So thank you both for being here and giving of your time and your knowledge and your stories. And I want to thank all the people who are, on screen and behind the screen working on this. So thank you to the ASL interpreters, to the closed captioning, to Keisha, Maria, and Sergio at IDA. And thank you for all of you for listening and for your great questions. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.